7:38 p.m. A Mediterranean beach. A soft breeze carries the scent of salt and expensive perfume. The company is celebrating a massive international contract. Lanterns glow along the sand. Red wine shimmers in crystal glasses. Smooth jazz floats through the air. At the very edge of the shore, a man stands alone. His light blue shirt sleeves are rolled up. He is staring at the distant horizon. The strategic director walks up, a mocking smirk on his face. Enjoying the view? Or is it a bit too refined for you? A few shallow laughs ripple through. The man turns. No, I'm looking at those lights. Adrian Keller was a man of steel and silence. At 43, his face was a map of 1,000 logistical puzzles, and the weight of a life lived in the hidden gears of industry. He was the head of supply chain operations for a major European logistics firm, a title that meant very little to the social climbers at the center of the party, but meant everything to the cargo ships currently navigating the dark waters of the Atlantic. Adrian had been a widower for 4 years. Since losing his wife, his life had become a rhythmic, grueling loop of spreadsheets and parenting. His North Star was his 11-year-old daughter, Elise. Unlike the other executives, Adrian didn't have a presence on the glossy covers of business magazines. He didn't post hustle culture quotes on social media, but when the system broke, when a storm delayed a shipment or a warehouse hit a terminal bottleneck, the entire board frantically looked for Adrian. The afternoon of this victory party had been particularly brutal. At 5:20 p.m., while the rest of the management team was already dressing in their Italian suits and checking their reflections, Adrian was standing in the heat of the harbor warehouse. A critical container destined for Northern Europe needed a final inspection. He didn't just trust the digital manifest, he walked the concrete floor, checking the seals himself. He knew that a mistake at the port today was a commercial disaster at the destination tomorrow. The smell of grease, diesel, and salt air followed him even now, clashing with the expensive cologne of the executives surrounding him. At 6:02 p.m., his phone had vibrated in his pocket. A text from Elise. Papa, will you read to me tonight? You missed the last 3 chapters, and the hero is stuck in the cave. He had felt a sharp, familiar pang of guilt twist in his chest. He typed back with his thumb. I'll try to be home early, sweetheart, I promise. We'll get the hero out together. But he knew the word early was a fragile lie. This celebration was mandatory, a hollow display of corporate unity for the new international investors who were currently sipping champagne and laughing at jokes they didn't quite understand. Now, standing on the cooling sand, Adrian felt the vast, invisible distance between himself and the heart of the celebration. In the center of the golden lanterns stood Helena Strauss, the 36-year-old CEO. She was a vision of focused ambition, her voice carrying over the waves as she talked about global vision, disruptive expansion, and market dominance. The contract they were celebrating was massive. It would expand the company into 3 new territories within 6 months. It was a victory, certainly, but Adrian's mind was still in the engine room. He was thinking about his operations team, men and women who had worked 18 days straight, skipping weekends and family dinners, just to prepare the data for this expansion. No one on that beach had mentioned their names. No one had thanked the people who actually moved the heavy steel boxes that generated the billions. Adrian stood at the very edge of the shore, not because he was shy, but because he was an observer. He understood that the foundation of a skyscraper is never the part people admire. Yet it is the only part that keeps the whole thing from falling. When the strategic director, a man who had never stepped foot in a warehouse, approached him with that mocking question about the refined view, Adrian wasn't offended. He was just exhausted by the pretense. He looked back at the harbor lights, the flickering orange stars of the industrial zone, and realized that his heart was there, among the workers, while his body was stuck here, among the wine. The silence that followed Adrian's reply was heavy, thick with the kind of sudden realization that makes the sound of the ocean waves feel jarringly loud. The strategic director's smirk didn't just vanish. No, it frozen. It morphed into something awkward, a mask of forced confusion. He was a man of optics, and he didn't know how to handle a subordinate who preferred harbor cranes to a Mediterranean sunset. Helena Strauss, however, had been standing just a few feet away, nursing a glass of mineral water. She hadn't joined the shallow laughter. Instead, she stepped away from the cluster of investors and walked toward the edge where Adrian stood. She didn't look like a CEO about to scold an employee. She looked like a scientist who had just discovered a variable she hadn't accounted for in her projections. "That was a very pointed thing to say, Adrian," she said softly. Her voice was cool, analytical, but notably devoid of the corporate performance she had been giving all night. "Are you implying that this party is a distraction from the real work?" Adrian turned to her, his gaze steady and unapologetic. He didn't lower his head. He didn't play the corporate game. "I wasn't implying anything, Helena. I was simply remembering. It's a dangerous habit in our industry, forgetting the dark reality of the floor when you're standing in the artificial light of a resort." Helena paused, looking down at her own silk dress, then out at the dark water. The smooth jazz continued to play, a surreal soundtrack to the sudden weight of the moment. "Do you think the team feels abandoned?" she asked, her voice dropping an octave. "The team feels invisible," Adrian replied, "and invisible people eventually stop caring about the global vision. Celebration is necessary for morale, yes, but a ship can't celebrate its top speed if the engine room is currently on fire. I think success looks much brighter when you're standing in the spotlight, but someone always has to adjust the power grid to keep those lights on for you." Helena walked a few steps along the shoreline, her heels sinking into the wet sand. "I know the team has worked hard. I've already approved the bonuses for the end of the quarter. They are significant." "Bonuses pay for things, Helena," Adrian said quietly, his voice cutting through the jazz. "But they don't pay for time. They don't pay for the school plays missed, or the doctor's appointments rescheduled, or the dinners eaten alone over a glowing laptop screen. The operations team has been working 18 days straight to prep for this northern expansion. 2 of my best leads are on the verge of a physical breakdown. One of them had to be driven home today because he was too dizzy to operate his own car." He paused, letting the reality sink in. "I sent a formal request for temporary staffing 2 weeks ago to ease the load. I told the board it was critical." Helena stopped. Her expression shifted, a flicker of genuine realization. "I remember that request. The strategy department marked it for review after the formal signing of the contract to keep the overhead costs looking low for the investors." "Everything is always after the signing," Adrian noted with a weary smile. "But the real work, the grinding, messy work, happens during the signing. While we sip vintage red wine on this beach, there is a technical crew at the harbor right now. They are under those orange lights trying to fix a logic glitch in the automated scanners. If they don't fix it by midnight, the morning shipments for the new partners will be delayed, and your international investors will be making their first angry phone call by breakfast." Helena looked out at the harbor. For the last 6 months, she had lived in boardrooms, airport lounges, and 5-star hotels. She had focused so intensely on the growth map that she had completely forgotten to look at the human map. She saw the flickering lights Adrian was pointing to. To her, they had always just been a pretty part of the background scenery. Now she realized they were the flickering heartbeat of her entire empire. "I didn't know it was that severe," she whispered almost to herself. "You don't usually see what runs below the surface," Adrian said, "and that's why you have people like me. But when leadership mocks the view of the harbor, it tells the people in that harbor that their lives don't matter to the company. It tells them they are just fuel to be burned." The conversation hung there, unfinished and raw. Adrian had dared to tell the absolute truth to the woman who controlled his career. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a scene, but he had stripped away the glamour of the Mediterranean night. Helena looked back at the crowd, the laughter, the silk, the polished shoes. For the first time that evening, she felt like a stranger at her own party. She realized that her strategic vision was a hollow shell if it didn't protect the people who built it. Adrian Keller had just given her a reality check more valuable than any billion-euro contract. 8:12 p.m. The melodic jazz was suddenly interrupted by a sharp, persistent ringing. Adrian reached into his pocket. It was the harbor terminal manager. He stepped away to take the call, his face hardening instantly into a mask of professional focus. He didn't shout, but his voice took on a cold, clinical efficiency that only comes from years of crisis management. When exactly did the sensors fail? Did you try the manual logic bypass? No. Don't reboot the main server yet. You'll lose the buffer data. Stay there. I'm coming. He hung up and walked straight toward Helena, ignoring the investors who were trying to pull her into a photo op. There's a critical failure in the barcode synchronization at the North Dock, he stated. It's a cascading error. If we don't override the logic gates manually within 90 minutes, the entire morning load, the first shipment of the new contract, is grounded. I have to go. The strategic director, overhearing this, walked over with a glass of champagne in each hand, his face flushed from the wine. Adrian, come on, don't be so dramatic. Let the junior staff handle it. That's what we pay them for. You're part of the leadership team tonight. Stay. Network. This is where the real business happens. He offered a glass with a wink. Adrian didn't even look at the glass. Leadership doesn't take the evening off when the foundation is cracking, he said, his voice level. He turned to Helena, his eyes searching hers one last time. Good night, ma'am. As Adrian turned to walk toward the parking lot, Helena made a decision that stunned the entire group. She didn't return to the investors. She handed her water glass to the shocked director, bent down and unbuckled her high-heeled shoes right there in the sand. Helena? The director stammered, his jaw dropping. Where are you going? The lead investor's waiting for the second toast. Tell them the CEO has a real job to do, she said, her voice sharp and decisive. She ran across the sand, catching up to Adrian. He was already at his car, unlocking the door, when he heard the crunch of sand and the sound of breathing behind him. He turned to see the CEO of a multi-billion-euro corporation, barefoot, carrying her designer shoes, her hair windswept, and her expression determined. I'm coming with you, she said. Helena, it's a warehouse, Adrian replied, surprised for the first time that night. It's loud, it's freezing, and it's covered in industrial grease. You're in a 3,000 euro dress. I've seen enough sunsets and expensive dresses for one lifetime, she replied. Show me the lights you were talking about. Show me the people I've been ignoring. The drive was 20 minutes of intense, focused silence. They transitioned from the golden artificial warmth of the resort to the harsh, clinical reality of the industrial harbor. When they arrived, the warehouse was flooded with cold, white fluorescent light. The atmosphere inside was frantic but disciplined. Helena walked through the massive steel doors and froze. She saw men and women with deep, dark circles under their eyes. Their uniforms were smudged with dust and oil. These weren't logistics data points on a slide deck. They were human beings. She watched Adrian move. He didn't give a speech. He didn't bark orders from a distance. He immediately took off his blue overshirt, revealing a plain white undershirt. He grabbed a ruggedized tablet, knelt on the dirty concrete, and crawled into a narrow service crawl space alongside the lead technician, a man who looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. For the next hour, Helena didn't watch a CEO. She watched a coordinator. She watched Adrian listen. He didn't pretend to know more than the techs. He asked for their opinions. He acknowledged their exhaustion. He made the final call on the manual logic bypass, but he did it with them, not above them. Helena found herself standing near a group of night shift workers who were waiting for the system to reboot. One of them, a woman named Marta, looked at Helena's dress, then at her bare feet. Rough night at the party? Marta asked with a tired, knowing smirk. I was looking at the wrong map, Helena admitted honestly. When the green light finally flashed on the main console at 9:45 p.m., signaling that the synchronization was restored and the cargo was cleared, the room didn't erupt in cheers. There was just a collective, heavy sigh of relief. The night shift workers sat down on wooden crates, wiping sweat from their brows with the backs of their hands. Helena walked over to Adrian as he emerged from the crawl space, his hands and arms covered in a fine layer of industrial oil. Why didn't you speak up earlier about the staffing, Adrian? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. I mean, why didn't you push harder? Why didn't you yell at me? Adrian looked at her, his hazel eyes reflecting the cold, honest light of the warehouse. In my world, Helena, when you push too hard against a wall that doesn't want to move, You eventually stop pushing and start finding ways to work around it. I chose to protect my team in the small ways I could, by being here with them, rather than fighting a boardroom that only cared about the optics of a signing ceremony. And tonight, she asked? Tonight you asked a question, Adrian replied simply. And tonight, you finally chose to see. Helena turned to the small group of night shift workers. She didn't have a prepared speech. She didn't have a teleprompter or a PR coach. She just stood there barefoot on the cold concrete floor and said, I apologize to all of you. I've been leading from a height that made me blind. We will not celebrate a growth that costs you your health or your families. Starting tomorrow morning, the rules of this company change. And I want to thank Adrian for reminding me that leadership begins below the surface. The workers looked at each other, stunned into silence. It wasn't the strategic vision they were used to. It was the truth. Adrian looked at Helena, and for the first time that night, he saw a leader he could actually follow. Not because of her title, but because of her courage to stand on the floor. The change didn't arrive with a loud stage press conference or a glossy internal magazine. It arrived quietly, through the veins of the company's internal system. The very next morning, before the investors had even woken up from their party hangovers, a company-wide email went out from the CEO's personal account. Short-term KPIs were reduced by 20% to allow for a safety and wellness reset. The budget for temporary staffing, the one Adrian had requested weeks ago, was approved immediately with a Priority 1 status. Most importantly, a special night shift recognition and support fund was established. No more after the signing. The work was happening now, and the support was happening now. Helena called Adrian into her office a few days later. The glass walls and expensive minimalist furniture were the same, but the atmosphere had shifted. She had a printed, wrinkled copy of his old staffing request on her mahogany desk. You could have embarrassed me on that beach, Adrian, she said, looking at him over the top of her glasses. You could have made a scene in front of the international investors and potentially ruined the optics of the entire contract. The strategic director wanted me to fire you for insubordination the moment we got back. A scene is for ego, Helena, Adrian said, sitting across from her. I wasn't looking for a fight. I was looking for balance. Balance, she repeated, nodding slowly. I've realized that my strategic vision was leaning so far into the future that I was tipping the whole company over. I forgot that the future is only built by people living in the present. I want you to join the executive board, Adrian, not as a manager, but as the senior director of operational sustainability. I want you to be the voice in the room that reminds us to look down at the floor before we look out at the horizon. Adrian smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his face. I'll accept, on one condition. What is that? Helena asked, bracing herself for a salary demand. I don't do golf on weekends, and my phone goes off at 6 p.m. for story time. Helena laughed, a sound of pure relief. Fair enough. I think I might start doing the same. Adrian left the office and drove home. For the first time in months, he arrived while the sun was still high and golden in the sky. He walked into his house and heard the familiar, comforting sound of a pencil scratching against paper. Elise was on the sofa, her tongue tucked in the corner of her mouth, a sketchbook open in her lap. You're home early, she cried, dropping her pencil and jumping up to hug him so hard he stumbled. I told you I'd try, Adrian said, burying his face in her hair. And tonight, the harbor was quiet enough to let me go. Did you enjoy the big sea party? She asked, looking up at him. I did, Adrian replied, sitting down beside her. But I think I prefer the sea when it's quieter. And when I'm with you. Elise showed him her sketchbook. She had drawn a new picture. It wasn't just a plane or a cargo ship this time. It was a complex, beautiful scene. At the bottom, there was a busy harbor with many tiny, colorful people working. In the middle, a large warehouse. And at the very top, a tiny person on a balcony looking down. But in the drawing, the person on the balcony was holding a long golden rope, helping the people at the bottom climb up toward the light. At the bottom of the page, she had written in her neat 11-year-old script, everyone stands somewhere important, but the best ones remember where they started. Adrian felt a thick lump form in his throat. He realized that his daughter had seen the shadow he had been carrying for years, and she had instinctively turned it into a bridge. He spent the entire evening reading to her, 4 chapters instead of 1. The hero got out of the cave. He didn't check his email once. He didn't look at a single spreadsheet. He was exactly where he needed to be. Helena Strauss, meanwhile, sat in her penthouse apartment overlooking the city. She didn't look at the skyscrapers tonight. She looked toward the distant harbor lights. She realized that her definition of power had been fundamentally wrong for 36 years. Real power wasn't the ability to command a room. It was the ability to listen to the silence of the people who made that room possible. Adrian Keller hadn't just changed her company. He had changed the way she looked at her own reflection in the glass. 3 months later, the company had not only met its expansion goals, but it had also recorded its highest employee satisfaction scores in the history of the firm. The turnover rate in the operations department had dropped to nearly zero. The international partners were thrilled because, for the first time in their experience, not a single shipment had been delayed or mismanaged during a major transition. The Adrian method was being studied by business schools. A new company-wide meeting was held to celebrate the first quarter of the expansion. This time, however, the venue was different. It wasn't at a luxury resort or a five-star hotel. It was held in a massive cleared-out section of the harbor warehouse. There were no silk dresses, no crystal glasses, and no VIP-only sections. There was just good, simple food from local vendors, music played by a band made up of warehouse technicians, and everyone, from the long-haul drivers to the board members, was in the same room, breathing the same air. Helena stood on a temporary wooden stage made of shipping pallets. She didn't talk about market dominance or disruption. She talked about the harbor soul. "We are a company that looks forward," she told the cheering crowd, "but we are now a company that finally remembers to look down. Thank you for reminding me that leadership isn't a view from the top. It's a heavy responsibility to the foundation that holds us all up." Adrian didn't stand on the stage with her. He refused the spotlight. He was at the back of the room, standing with Marta and the rest of the night shift crew he had crawled through the grease with 3 months ago. He was laughing at a joke one of the technicians told about a faulty sensor. He didn't look like a senior director. He looked like a man who finally belonged. That evening, after the meeting, Adrian took Elise for a walk along a real beach, one without lanterns, corporate sponsors, or strategic directors. Just the two of them, the cold sand between their toes, and the rhythmic, ancient sound of the Mediterranean waves. The air was cool, and the moon was a silver sliver hanging in the dark sky. They walked in silence for a long time, their feet leaving twin sets of prints in the wet sand. Elise looked out at the water, then up at her father, her eyes bright with a peace he hadn't seen in her since her mother died. "Papa?" she asked softly. "Yes, sweetheart? Are you enjoying the view tonight?" Adrian stopped and looked at her. He thought about the beach party 3 months ago. He thought about the oil on his hands in the warehouse and the tension of the board meetings. He thought about the golden rope in her drawing. Then he looked at his daughter, at the beautiful, honest life they had built together after so much loss. "I am, Elise," he said, his voice thick with a genuine emotion he no longer felt the need to hide. "I am, because this time, I'm not alone in the view." He realized that the director's mockery on that beach had been the greatest gift he had ever received. It had forced him to speak a truth he had been whispering for years, and that truth had liberated not just his team, but his own soul. He was no longer the man standing at the edge of the party, watching the world go by. He was the man who had brought the party to the people who actually deserved it. The harbor lights twinkled in the distance, no longer a symbol of overlooked labor, but a reminder of a promise kept. If you believe quiet courage can change more than loud ambition, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever chosen to speak softly and still change the entire room?